What if the greatest empire on earth did not fall because it was weak, but because it believed it could never be defeated? Long before Rome rose to power, before Greece dreamed of glory, there was Persia, an empire so vast that its borders swallowed continents, so rich that gold flowed through its palaces like water, so organized that messages could cross thousands of miles in days along the royal road. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Anatolia, from the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia to the distant edges of India, the Persian Empire stood as the first true superpower of the ancient world. It was not merely a kingdom, it was a system, a machine of governance, tolerance, taxation, and military strength. Its rulers called themselves King of Kings, and the title was no exaggeration. Under Cyrus the Great, Persia had begun as a rebellion against the mighty Medes, but within a generation it had consumed Lydia, Babylon, and lands beyond imagination. Cyrus did not rule through terror alone, he ruled through policy, allowing conquered peoples to keep their customs and religions, earning loyalty instead of constant rebellion. Under Darius I, the empire transformed from conquest into structure. Provinces were divided into satrapies, each governed by officials who answered directly to the throne. Tribute flowed inward, armies were standardized, roads were built, canals were dug. The empire became not just large, but efficient. At its height, Persia commanded millions of subjects, spoke dozens of languages, and maintained control over trade routes that fed the known world. Its armies were immense, drawn from every corner of its lands, disciplined and feared. Its capitals, Susa, Ecbatana, Babylon, and above all Persepolis, shimmered with carved stone reliefs, towering columns, and ceremonial stairways where delegations from across the empire brought gifts to the great king. To stand in Persepolis was to feel the weight of history pressing down from marble walls, to sense the certainty of permanence. This empire had survived revolts, wars with Greece, internal struggles, and succession crises. It had endured because it was adaptable, centralized yet flexible, brutal when needed, yet pragmatic when possible. By the time Darius III inherited the throne, Persia had ruled for over 2 centuries. No enemy had truly threatened its existence since its foundation. The idea that a foreign army could shatter it seemed absurd. The Persian system was too vast, too wealthy, too deeply rooted. Its bureaucracy functioned, its treasuries overflowed, its nobles controlled lands beyond imagination. But hidden beneath the polished stone and gold-lined halls were cracks, invisible at first, subtle in their spread. An empire of that scale required absolute unity at the top and constant vigilance in the provinces. It demanded loyalty not only from subjects, but from generals and governors who commanded immense local power. And when belief in invincibility replaces caution, when comfort replaces reform, when a throne is inherited rather than earned through conquest, something begins to shift. Persia did not know it yet, but its greatest threat was already rising in the west. Not a vast empire, not a seasoned superpower, but a young king from a rugged land called Macedon. And when he crossed into Asia, the empire that ruled the world would face a challenge unlike any before. Where news first reached the Persian court that a young Macedonian king had crossed the Hellespont with a relatively small army, few in Susa or Persepolis felt alarm. Persia had seen ambitious rulers before. Greek city-states had rebelled and been crushed. Egyptian uprisings had flared and been extinguished. Even the long wars against Athens and Sparta had failed to threaten the empire's existence. To the Persian elite, Alexander was merely another provincial ruler seeking glory. The true danger, they believed, lay not in foreign invasion, but in maintaining the delicate balance of power within their own borders. Darius III had come to the throne not through a seamless dynastic line, but through court intrigue and the elimination of rivals. His authority rested less on overwhelming charisma and more on the inherited machinery of empire. Yet that machinery had grown heavy and slow. Satraps governed distant territories with increasing independence, commanding local armies and wealth that rivaled smaller kingdoms. While tribute flowed to the center, loyalty was more fragile than it appeared. Darius, aware of the fragility of his position, focused on consolidating authority rather than personally leading early campaigns against the Macedonian threat. His generals were dispatched to handle the intrusion, confident that numbers alone would smother any advance. Persia's military doctrine relied on scale, vast infantry formations, elite cavalry, archers drawn from multiple regions, and the famed immortals, a corps whose numbers were always maintained at 10,000. Against such force, what could 30 or 40,000 Macedonians achieve? The confidence was not entirely misplaced. The Persian Empire had resources that dwarfed those of Macedon. It could raise new armies even after defeat, finance mercenaries from Greece itself, and leverage alliances across Asia Minor. But in dismissing Alexander as insignificant, the court overlooked something fundamental. This was not a rebellion within a province, it was a campaign led by a commander who understood speed, cohesion, and strategic warfare. Alexander moved quickly, refusing to allow the Persians time to gather overwhelming force. At the Granicus River, Persian satraps chose to confront him directly, assuming that the river itself would hinder his advance. They underestimated his willingness to charge headlong into danger. The battle was fierce, chaotic, and shocking. Macedonian cavalry broke through elite Persian units, and many noble commanders fell. It was not merely a tactical loss, it was a signal that the invader was not to be taken lightly. Yet even after Granicus, Darius did not immediately march west. Reports were filtered, reassurances offered. The empire had survived setbacks before. Its sheer size provided resilience. But the problem with vast empires is that distance dulls urgency. While Persia deliberated, Alexander advanced, capturing coastal cities, cutting off naval bases, isolating Persian fleets. The King of Kings still believed that when he finally faced this challenger, sheer numbers and royal authority would restore order. He did not yet grasp that warfare had shifted from massed numbers to disciplined formations and strategic daring. The illusion of untouchability remained intact in the gilded halls of Persepolis, but on the battlefield, reality was beginning to fracture that illusion, piece by piece. The Persian Empire did not crumble in a single moment of defeat. It staggered under the weight of its own enormity long before Alexander reached its heart. Governing a territory that stretched across 3 continents demanded a system of astonishing complexity. Satrapies managed taxes, justice, military levies, and local administration, each overseen by officials who were expected to serve the great king with unwavering loyalty. Yet distance breeds autonomy. The further a province lay from Persepolis or Susa, the more its governor's power felt absolute.
Communication, though efficient for its time, still required days or weeks across deserts and mountains. Decisions made at the center arrived slowly at the edges, and by the time responses returned, circumstances had often changed. This lag created opportunities for corruption and quiet ambition. Tribute flowed in immense quantities: silver, grain, livestock, precious goods, but not all of it reached the imperial treasury intact. Local elites grew wealthy, commanding loyalty from soldiers and administrators who depended more on regional patronage than on distant royal favor. The empire's tolerance of diverse customs and religions, once a brilliant innovation that secured stability, also meant that loyalty was often pragmatic rather than passionate. Many subjects obeyed Persia because it was strong, not because they felt bound to it emotionally. In times of prosperity, this arrangement worked seamlessly. Trade flourished along the royal road, caravans moved freely, and imperial inspectors monitored the satraps. But in times of crisis, the sheer size of the empire became a liability. Mobilizing a truly unified army required coordination across thousands of miles. Forces assembled from different regions spoke different languages, followed different traditions, and relied on varied equipment and tactics. The Persian military was vast, but not always cohesive. Meanwhile, Alexander's army, though far smaller, was intensely unified. Macedonian phalanxes trained together relentlessly, their sarissas forming an impenetrable wall of disciplined movement. Cavalry units operated with precision under direct command. Decisions could be made instantly and executed without bureaucratic delay. As Alexander advanced deeper into Asia Minor, he exploited Persia's structural weaknesses. Cities along the coast were captured or persuaded to surrender, depriving the empire of naval bases and revenue. Each loss weakened the perception of inevitability that had long surrounded Persian authority. Yet within the imperial court, faith in recovery remained strong. After all, Persia had faced revolts before and suppressed them. It had fought Greeks before and survived. But this was different. This was not a rebellion seeking independence. It was a campaign aimed at the throne itself. The weight of governing millions across vast distances slowed every response. While Persia gathered its immense strength, Alexander moved with startling speed. And in warfare, speed can shatter giants before they even realize they are vulnerable. The empire that had once thrived because of its size was beginning to discover that the same vastness now hindered its ability to adapt swiftly to a new kind of threat. When Darius III finally met Alexander in open battle, many believed the confrontation at Issus would mark the end of the Macedonian threat. The great king commanded an army that vastly outnumbered the invaders. His forces stretched across the narrow plain between mountains and sea, a living wall of infantry, cavalry, archers, and chariots. In sheer numbers, Persia's advantage seemed overwhelming. Yet numbers alone do not decide history. The terrain at Issus worked against the Persian host. The narrow coastal strip compressed Darius's immense army, limiting its ability to deploy fully. What should have been an unstoppable tide became a crowded mass, unable to maneuver effectively. Alexander, observing the terrain carefully, understood that discipline could defeat scale. He led his companion cavalry with calculated aggression, striking at weak points with focused intensity. The Macedonian phalanx advanced in rigid formation, shields locked, sarasses extended like a forest of steel. The clash was violent and chaotic, but Alexander's leadership on the field proved decisive. He did not remain distant. He charged personally toward the Persian center, where Darius stood in his chariot. The psychological impact of that bold advance rippled across the battlefield. When Darius turned and fled, even briefly, panic spread faster than any command could counteract. In ancient warfare, morale was often more decisive than casualties. Once soldiers believed their king had abandoned them, cohesion dissolved. Persian units began to retreat, then to scatter. What might have been a strategic withdrawal turned into disorder. The defeat at Issus was not catastrophic in material terms. Persia still possessed vast resources and manpower, but symbolically it was devastating. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the empire for generations cracked visibly. For the first time, a foreign invader had not merely raided Persian lands, but defeated the great king in direct confrontation. Darius survived and would attempt to rebuild his forces, but confidence had been shaken. Across the empire, whispers spread. If the great king could be beaten once, could he be beaten again? Alexander capitalized on this psychological fracture. Rather than rushing eastward immediately, he turned south to secure coastal territories and sever Persia's naval power. Each captured city sent a message: the empire was not eternal. Yet Darius still believed redemption was possible. He assembled another vast army, drawing from the deepest reserves of his dominions. He prepared for a decisive confrontation on terrain of his choosing, hoping to erase the humiliation of Issus. But the deeper issue remained unresolved. Persia's command structure, reliant on royal presence and centralized authority, struggled to maintain unity after such a symbolic blow. The empire's strength had always rested partly on perception, and once perception falters, even the mightiest walls begin to weaken. Issus was not the final fall of Persia, but it was the moment when inevitability began to unravel, when a giant first staggered before a smaller, faster adversary who understood that history is shaped not just by power, but by momentum.
After Issus, Darius III did not vanish into obscurity. He retreated eastward, determined to rebuild what had been shaken but not yet destroyed. The Persian Empire was still immense, still wealthy, still capable of fielding armies that dwarfed Alexander's force. Yet something had changed that no treasury could repair. Authority in the Achaemenid system flowed from the king outward like the rays of the sun. If that center flickered, the provinces dimmed with it. Darius attempted diplomacy first. He offered Alexander vast sums of gold, territorial concessions west of the Euphrates, even the hand of his daughter in marriage. It was an extraordinary proposal, one that in another era might have ended the war with compromise, but Alexander rejected it, famously declaring that there could be no two suns in the sky. In that refusal lay a turning point. Persia was accustomed to negotiation from a position of dominance. Now it negotiated from weakness. Across the empire, satraps watched closely. Loyalty to the great king had always been pragmatic as much as personal.
As long as the king represented stability and inevitability, allegiance was simple. But after Issus, after the spectacle of royal retreat, some began to question whether backing Darius was still the safest path. Meanwhile, Alexander advanced methodically, capturing key coastal cities and isolating Persia's naval power. Tyre fell after a brutal siege, Gaza after stubborn resistance. Each victory tightened the psychological noose. When Alexander entered Egypt without significant opposition and was welcomed as a liberator rather than a conqueror, the contrast grew sharper. The Persian Empire had once inspired fear, now it struggled to inspire loyalty. Darius gathered his final massive army near Gaugamela, choosing open terrain that would favor his numbers and chariots. He prepared carefully, even ordering the ground leveled to maximize mobility. It was a calculated effort to correct the mistakes of Issus. But preparation cannot compensate for eroded confidence. The army assembled was enormous, drawn from across the empire's vast territories, yet unity was fragile. Many contingents fought for Persia, not out of devotion, but obligation. When battle began, Alexander again targeted the center. He exploited gaps, maneuvered with precision, and struck where morale was most vulnerable. And once more, when Darius retreated under pressure, even if strategically prudent, it signaled collapse. The army disintegrated faster than it had formed. For the second time, the great king fled the field. In ancient warfare, kings were anchors of cohesion. When they withdrew, even momentarily, the perception of abandonment spread like fire. After Gaugamela, the empire was no longer merely shaken, it was structurally compromised. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis opened their gates. Darius, once ruler of the largest empire on earth, became a fugitive in his own dominions. His authority dissolved not only because he lost battles, but because he lost belief. The Persian Empire did not fall in a single clash of steel. It began to fall when his king could no longer embody certainty. In empires built upon centralized prestige, hesitation can be deadlier than defeat.
When Alexander marched toward Babylon after the victory at Gaugamela, he did not face towering resistance or desperate last stands. Instead, he encountered something far more revealing: silence. The great city that had once trembled beneath the authority of Persian kings now opened its gates without a fight. Priests and nobles came forward with gifts, acknowledging Alexander not as a destroyer, but as a successor. This moment was more than symbolic. It exposed how fragile Persian control over its western territories had become. Babylon had long been a jewel within the Achaemenid crown, rich in culture and tradition older than Persia itself. Its people had tolerated Persian rule because it provided order and protection, not because it inspired passionate loyalty. When Darius fled and Alexander approached victorious, pragmatism prevailed. Allegiance shifted not through betrayal, but through calculation. Alexander, keenly aware of optics, entered Babylon with restraint. He honored local customs, restored temples, and presented himself as a legitimate heir to imperial authority, rather than a foreign conqueror. In doing so, he achieved something Persia had failed to secure in its final years: emotional investment.
The Persian system relied on administrative efficiency and centralized dominance, but it increasingly lacked adaptive charisma. As more cities surrendered peacefully, the pattern became undeniable. The empire was not collapsing solely under external assault. It was reconfiguring itself around a new center of gravity. Alexander's genius was not only military, but psychological. He did not seek to annihilate the Persian structure, he sought to inherit it. Each gate that opened without resistance weakened Darius further. The great king was now reduced to a figurehead fleeing eastward, attempting to rally provinces that had already begun hedging their bets. Meanwhile, Alexander's momentum created a narrative of inevitability. In ancient politics, perception often outweighs force. If a ruler appears unstoppable, opposition becomes irrational. Babylon's surrender signaled to the wider empire that resistance might not be heroic, but futile. This realization spread faster than any army could march. When Susa and later Persepolis fell into Alexander's hands, the symbolic heart of Achaemenid prestige fractured. The palaces of Persian kings, once embodiments of invincible authority, now stood vulnerable. Though Alexander famously allowed Persepolis to burn, whether from calculation or impulse, the act marked the visible end of Persian dominance. Yet by the time flames rose against the night sky, the empire had already been hollowed. Babylon's quiet capitulation revealed the deeper truth. Empires fall when their subjects cease to believe in their permanence. Alexander did not need to conquer every wall. He only needed to replace the idea of Persia as eternal. And in Babylon, that replacement began without a single desperate defense.
As city after city acknowledged Alexander's authority, Darius III retreated deeper into the vast eastern reaches of his empire, hoping distance would buy him time and loyalty would gather behind him once more. But distance does not rebuild confidence, and loyalty strained by defeat does not return simply because a king commands it. Darius moved through Media and toward the eastern satrapies, attempting to reorganize what remained of his forces. He still possessed territories untouched by Macedonian invasion, lands rich in resources and manpower. Yet the aura that once surrounded the great king had faded. In the Achaemenid world, kingship was inseparable from divine favor and visible strength. Repeated defeats fractured that sacred image. Rumors traveled ahead of him, of lost battles, of surrendered cities, of Alexander welcomed as liberator rather than invader. In ancient empires, perception spreads faster than couriers. Darius's authority, once unquestioned, now required reassurance. The satraps who governed distant provinces had long enjoyed autonomy under Persian administration. In prosperous times, this decentralization ensured stability. In a crisis, it created hesitation. Some remained loyal out of tradition. Others began to calculate their survival. Among them was Bessus, satrap of Bactria, a nobleman with ambition and anxiety in equal measure. As Alexander advanced relentlessly eastward, Darius found himself relying increasingly on men whose commitment to him was pragmatic rather than passionate. Each retreat risked further erosion of legitimacy. Yet Darius still believed he could regroup, that the empire's vastness would ultimately exhaust the Macedonian army.
Persia had once expanded through patience and resilience. Perhaps it could survive through the same qualities. But Alexander refused to pause. He pursued Darius across deserts and mountains, transforming the campaign into a chase. The symbolism was devastating. A great king fleeing before a foreign conqueror contradicted the very essence of Persian royal ideology. When Darius was finally betrayed by his own officers, seized and later murdered during their attempted escape, the empire's heart was pierced not by Macedonian steel, but by internal fracture. Alexander arrived too late to confront him alive. Instead, he found the fallen king abandoned, a victim of desperation and ambition. In a calculated gesture, Alexander honored Darius with royal rights, presenting himself as avenger rather than enemy. With Darius dead, resistance could no longer rally around a legitimate Achaemenid sovereign. The empire's political center dissolved entirely. Yet this final act of betrayal did not mark a sudden collapse. It confirmed what had been unfolding for years. An empire that could not guarantee unified loyalty in crisis was already compromised. Darius's flight revealed the ultimate vulnerability of Persia, its reliance on centralized royal authority without cultivating a resilient succession of leadership. Once that center faltered, the periphery unraveled. And as Alexander claimed the mantle of Persian kingship, the Achaemenid Empire ceased, not with a climactic battle, but with a silent transfer of legitimacy.
When Darius III died, the Persian Empire did not collapse in a single thunderclap. Instead, it entered a strange, uncertain twilight. The throne was empty, but the lands remained vast, stretching from the Aegean shores to the valleys of Central Asia. For generations, the empire had been defined by a single, almost sacred idea: the great king as the pivot of order, the living link between heaven and earth. Without him, that cosmic balance felt disrupted. Satraps still governed their provinces, taxes were still collected, roads were still patrolled, but the unifying symbol that held this immense structure together had vanished. In theory, Bessus attempted to claim legitimacy by declaring himself king under the name Artaxerxes V, presenting his act not as treachery, but as necessity. He argued that Darius had been incapable of saving the empire and that strong leadership was required to resist Alexander. Yet his claim rang hollow. Bessus lacked the lineage, the ceremonial authority, and most importantly, the recognition of the empire's core territories. His rule was regional at best, contested and fragile. Meanwhile, Alexander advanced not merely as conqueror, but as successor. This was perhaps the most decisive shift in the entire campaign. Rather than destroying Persian institutions, Alexander adopted them. He dressed in Persian garments, maintained the administrative system, and presented himself as the legitimate heir of Darius. To many local elites, this was less a conquest than a transition. The empire as a governing mechanism could survive under new leadership. For the Persian nobility, survival often meant accommodation, and here lay the deeper truth. The empire had grown accustomed to pragmatism. Its strength had always been flexibility, tolerance, and administrative continuity. But that same flexibility now eased its transformation into something else. There was no unified national identity in the modern sense that demanded collective resistance. Loyalty was personal, directed toward the king, not abstractly toward the empire itself. Once the king was gone, allegiance could be transferred.
In some regions, resistance flared, particularly in the eastern provinces, where loyalty to local rulers was stronger. But these uprisings were fragmented, lacking coordination. Alexander suppressed them systematically. The empire's roads, once instruments of cohesion, now served the invader, facilitating rapid movement of troops and communication. The very infrastructure that had enabled Persian dominance now facilitated its absorption. Thus, the fall of Persia was not an explosion, but a diffusion. Authority seeped away, absorbed into a new framework. Alexander's empire would not endure long after his own death, but in that moment he had accomplished something extraordinary. He convinced much of Persia that continuity was preferable to annihilation. And so the Persian Empire did not vanish in flames, it transformed under foreign hands. The tragedy was not merely military defeat, but the quiet realization that the empire's identity had been inseparable from its monarch. Remove that figure, and the grand edifice became adaptable, even replaceable. In that adaptability lay both the genius and the fatal weakness of Achaemenid rule.
At first glance, nothing seemed to have changed. The roads still stretched across deserts and mountains. Tribute still arrived in Babylon and Susa. Officials still recorded transactions on clay tablets. Priests still offered prayers beneath the same skies their fathers had known. If one had walked through the administrative halls of the empire in those first months after Darius's death, one might have mistaken the moment for stability. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had occurred. The illusion of continuity masked a transformation that could not be undone. Alexander understood something essential about power. It does not always require destruction. Often it requires adoption. Rather than dismantling the Persian state, he stepped into it. He kept satraps in their positions when possible, confirmed local rulers in their authority, and maintained tax systems that had functioned for decades. He presented himself not as the enemy of Persia, but as its rightful king. To many, this was persuasive. The empire had always been multi-ethnic, multilingual, and religiously diverse. Loyalty was not bound by shared culture, but by shared administration and royal legitimacy. If Alexander could claim the latter, the former would follow. Yet this seamless transition concealed deeper fractures. Persian aristocrats were divided. Some chose cooperation, believing survival and influence were possible under the new regime. Others retreated eastward, clinging to hopes of restoration. But coordination was lacking. The empire had never relied on unified resistance among its provinces. Its cohesion had depended on centralized authority. Without a universally recognized great king from the Achaemenid line, there was no figure around whom rebellion could coherently gather. Meanwhile, Alexander began integrating Macedonian officers into key positions, subtly altering the balance of power. Persian nobles found themselves sharing authority with foreign commanders. This was not merely political change, it was cultural disruption. The court rituals evolved. Greek language increasingly appeared alongside Aramaic. Military priorities shifted. The empire's identity, once anchored in Achaemenid tradition, slowly blurred into a hybrid form. For many ordinary subjects, daily life continued. Farmers tilled their land, merchants traveled trade routes, temples remained active, but at the highest levels, the symbolic heart of the empire had shifted.
The King of Kings was no longer Persian. The divine aura that had surrounded Cyrus and Darius was replaced by a young conqueror whose legitimacy rested on victory rather than ancestry. Some accepted him, others merely endured him. And here lies a subtle but decisive moment in the empire's fall. An empire can survive defeat if it retains a clear sense of identity and a legitimate center. Persia retained its institutions, but it lost its narrative. The story that had bound its peoples together, of divine mandate, of Achaemenid destiny, dissolved. What replaced it was pragmatic rule under foreign leadership, efficient, perhaps even stable for a time, but no longer Persian in essence. Thus the empire continued to function, yet it had already fallen in spirit. It had not been burned to ashes, it had been rewritten. And in that rewriting, the old Persia quietly disappeared, leaving behind structures that looked familiar but no longer belonged to the same world that Cyrus had once envisioned centuries before.
Far to the east, in the vast lands beyond Mesopotamia, Darius III was still alive, though no longer a king in truth. His army had dissolved, his authority shattered, his capitals taken one by one. What remained was flight. With a small retinue of loyal followers and a handful of nobles, he moved deeper into the empire's eastern provinces, hoping to gather strength among the satraps of Bactria and Sogdiana. These were regions distant from the Mediterranean world, lands of mountains and open plains where Persian influence had long intertwined with local traditions. If anywhere still held hope for resistance, it would be there. Yet even here loyalty wavered. The satrap Bessus, entrusted with authority over Bactria, faced a choice. Should he remain loyal to a defeated king whose armies had been broken again and again? Or should he seize control himself and attempt to rally resistance under new leadership? In moments of imperial crisis, ambition often reveals itself. As Darius traveled eastward, his authority diminished with every step. His title as King of Kings still carried weight in name, but without armies or treasure, that weight was hollow. The nobles around him understood this. Some feared Alexander's relentless pursuit. Others doubted Darius's ability to recover power. Trust eroded quietly, like stone worn by unseen water. Then came betrayal. Bessus and several conspirators arrested Darius, binding their own king as if he were a criminal. They declared him unfit to lead and proclaimed Bessus himself as the new ruler, adopting the royal name Artaxerxes in an attempt to claim legitimacy. It was a desperate gamble, an effort to preserve Persian sovereignty under a different banner. But the act shattered what remained of unity. Alexander, informed of these events, pressed forward with even greater urgency. When he finally reached Darius, it was too late. The former king lay dying, abandoned and wounded by those who had once sworn loyalty to him. Accounts describe Alexander approaching the fallen monarch, covering him with his cloak and promising vengeance against the traitors. Whether this gesture was sincere or strategic, it carried profound symbolism. With Darius's death, the Achaemenid line effectively ended. No surviving prince commanded recognition. No council of nobles could restore continuity. The dynasty that had ruled from the Indus to the Aegean for more than 2 centuries had collapsed, not in battle, but in fragmentation. Alexander, by avenging Darius and condemning his betrayers, positioned himself not merely as conqueror, but as successor.
He presented Bessus as a rebel against legitimate authority, thereby framing his continued campaigns in the East as acts of justice rather than conquest. Yet the truth was stark. The empire's final king had died not defending his throne in glory, but as a fugitive betrayed by his own elite. In that lonely death on a distant road, the last thread of Achaemenid sovereignty snapped. Persia did not fall because Alexander killed its king in combat. It fell because its king could no longer command loyalty from his own commanders. And once that bond broke, no wall, no army, no vast territory could hold the empire together any longer.
With Darius dead and no unified resistance remaining in the West, Alexander faced a decision that would shape the future of the conquered lands. He could present himself as a foreign conqueror ruling through fear, or he could step into the role once held by the Achaemenid monarchs. He chose the latter. In Babylon, in Susa, and later in Persepolis, he performed rituals that aligned him with Persian royal tradition. He adopted elements of Persian dress, sat upon the great king's throne, and began to refer to himself not merely as King of Macedon, but as King of Asia. To many Greeks and Macedonians, this was unsettling. They had followed Alexander to defeat Persia, not to become Persians. Yet Alexander understood something fundamental. Empires are not sustained by destruction alone. They are sustained by continuity. By assuming the mantle of the Persian king, he aimed to inherit the loyalty of its administrators, nobles, and subjects. He retained many Persian satraps in their positions, demanded allegiance rather than annihilation, and sought to blend Macedonian and Persian elites into a new ruling class. This policy, pragmatic and visionary, was also risky. Among his own men, resentment grew. The rituals of proskynesis, in which subjects bowed before the king in Persian fashion, offended Macedonian sensibilities. They saw themselves as companions of their king, not his subjects. Yet for the Persians, these gestures were signs of legitimacy. Alexander walked a narrow path between two worlds, attempting to bind them into one empire under his authority. Meanwhile, resistance continued in the eastern provinces. Bessus, who had betrayed Darius, attempted to rally support as a defender of Persian sovereignty against foreign domination. Alexander pursued him relentlessly across vast distances, through deserts and mountains, refusing to allow any rival claim to the throne to survive. When Bessus was finally captured, Alexander had him mutilated and executed in Persian fashion for regicide. This act reinforced his claim that he was avenging the rightful king, not overthrowing him. In doing so, Alexander completed a transformation. He was no longer simply the invader who had defeated Persia in battle. He was the inheritor of its imperial structure. The administrative systems, the roads, the tribute networks, and the satrapal divisions remained largely intact. The empire did not vanish, it changed hands. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity lay a deeper rupture. The Achaemenid dynasty, with its centuries of accumulated legitimacy, its sacred traditions, and its symbolic authority, was gone. Alexander could wear the crown, but he could not recreate the ancient web of loyalty that had once bound nobles and provinces to the house of Cyrus.
What he inherited was territory and infrastructure, not the same emotional allegiance. Persia as a state survived in altered form, but Persia as an independent dynasty ended irrevocably. The transformation was complete. The great king was dead, and in his place stood a young Macedonian who had absorbed an empire even as he dismantled its foundations. The fall of Persia did not erase its influence, but it ensured that its future would no longer be its own.
When Alexander entered Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, he stepped into a city that symbolized centuries of imperial power. Its terraces rose from the plain like a man-made mountain, crowned with columns that seemed to touch the sky. Reliefs carved into stone showed delegations from across the known world bringing tribute to the great king. Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, each rendered in precise detail, each a testament to the reach of Persian authority. For generations, Persepolis had stood not merely as a capital, but as a monument to the idea that Persia ruled by divine sanction and universal order. Alexander allowed his troops to plunder the city. Gold and silver accumulated over decades were seized and distributed. The treasure was immense, enough to finance further campaigns and secure loyalty among his soldiers. Yet it was not the looting alone that marked the turning point. One night, after a feast heavy with wine and triumph, the decision was made to burn the royal palace complex. Ancient sources offer different explanations. Some claim it was a calculated act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century earlier. Others suggest it was the impulsive outcome of drunken celebration, encouraged by companions eager to dramatize victory. Whatever the immediate cause, the result was unmistakable. Flames rose through the cedar beams and across the decorated halls. The carved reliefs, the painted chambers, the throne rooms where kings had once received homage were consumed by fire. As the blaze illuminated the night, it signaled more than destruction of stone and wood. It was the deliberate annihilation of a symbol. Persepolis had represented the continuity of Persian kingship, the ritual center where New Year ceremonies reaffirmed the cosmic order under Achaemenid rule. By burning it, Alexander sent a message that the old order was finished. Even if he intended later to rule as king of Asia, this act severed the visible link to the dynasty he had replaced. The fire at Persepolis became an emblem of the empire's irreversible fall. Yet the destruction was not total. Many structures survived, and the administrative machinery of the empire continued elsewhere. The satrapies remained, the roads functioned, trade persisted. But psychologically, the burning marked the end of an era. For Persian nobles and subjects alike, it demonstrated that the sacred center of their empire could be reduced to ash. Alexander later expressed regret, according to some accounts, recognizing that he had destroyed something irreplaceable. Whether regret was genuine or politically convenient, the damage had been done. Persepolis stood blackened and scarred, a monument to both past grandeur and present subjugation. In that moment, the fall of Persia became more than a transfer of power. It became a spectacle of symbolic domination. The flames that consumed the palace did not erase Persian culture, but they extinguished the visible embodiment of Achaemenid sovereignty. The empire had lost its heart, and though its body still functioned, it would never beat in the same way again. After the burning of Persepolis, the Persian Empire no longer existed as a unified force.
yet its king still lived. Darius III had fled eastward, moving through Media and into the vast interior of his dominion, hoping to gather new troops from the eastern satrapies. The lands beyond the Zagros Mountains were immense and distant from Alexander's immediate control. There, Darius believed, he could rebuild resistance, rally loyal governors, and remind the empire that his king had not surrendered. But time was not on his side. Each retreat weakened his authority. Satraps who once swore loyalty now questioned whether following a defeated monarch was wise. Some feared Alexander more than they respected Darius. Others saw opportunity in chaos. Among them was Bessus, satrap of Bactria, a man with ambitions of his own. As Alexander advanced relentlessly eastward, Darius's circle shrank. Supplies were scarce, morale was low. The great king, once ruler of lands stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, was now a fugitive moving through his own empire. His authority depended on the perception of strength, and that perception had shattered at Issus and Gaugamela. Eventually, betrayal replaced loyalty. Bessus and several conspirators arrested Darius, placing him in chains. Their plan was clear. If Alexander caught up, they would present Darius as a bargaining piece, or eliminate him and claim leadership themselves. In the summer of 330 BCE, as Alexander's cavalry closed the distance, the conspirators made their choice. Darius was stabbed and left in a wagon on the roadside, abandoned by those who once called him king. When Alexander arrived, he found the Persian monarch dying. According to ancient accounts, Darius requested water and entrusted his family to Alexander's protection. Whether embellished or not, the story carried symbolic weight. The conqueror now stood over the fallen king, not as a rival general, but as the last witness to his end. Darius III's death marked the final extinguishing of Achaemenid rule. With him died the direct line of Persian kings who traced their legitimacy back to Cyrus the Great. Alexander ordered Darius's body to be treated with royal honors and sent for burial according to Persian customs. It was a calculated gesture. By honoring Darius in death, Alexander positioned himself not merely as a destroyer, but as successor. He adopted elements of Persian dress, court ceremony, and administrative structure, signaling continuity even as he reshaped power. Yet the empire that Darius had inherited and failed to preserve was already transformed. His death did not cause the fall, it confirmed it. The loyalty of satraps dissolved. Bessus declared himself king under a new name, but his claim lacked legitimacy and support. Alexander pursued and executed him, eliminating the last pretender to the Achaemenid throne. With Darius gone, resistance fragmented into regional rebellions rather than imperial defense. The Persian Empire had fallen, not in a single battle, nor solely in flames at Persepolis, but in a lonely wagon on a dusty road, where its king died abandoned by his own commanders.
Even after the death of Darius III, the conquest of Persia was not complete. The empire had fallen in name, but its eastern provinces did not immediately accept Macedonian rule. The lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, stretching across harsh deserts and high mountain ranges, were distant from the ceremonial capitals of the West. These regions had long been accustomed to semi-autonomous rule under Persian oversight. Their loyalty to the Achaemenid king had often been pragmatic rather than emotional. When Darius died, they did not see Alexander as a legitimate successor.
Instead, they saw a foreign invader attempting to impose authority over territories that were difficult to control, even for native rulers. The geography of the East favored resistance. Fortified hilltops, narrow passes, and vast open steppes made organized conquest slow and exhausting. Local leaders, often former Persian officials or tribal chieftains, rallied fighters who knew the terrain intimately. They avoided large set-piece battles. Instead, they launched raids, ambushes, and sudden strikes against supply lines. Alexander, accustomed to decisive confrontations, found himself engaged in a different kind of war, one of attrition and endurance. The campaigns in the East lasted years, not months. They tested the limits of Macedonian morale. Soldiers who had marched from Greece to the heart of Asia began to question how far they were expected to go. Each victory seemed to open another frontier. Alexander responded with a mixture of force and integration. He founded cities, often named after himself, establishing garrisons and administrative centers meant to anchor control. These settlements served as military outposts and symbols of permanence, yet they were also signs that conquest required consolidation. The Persian administrative model, which relied on satrapies governed by local elites under central oversight, had once allowed such distant lands to remain tied to the empire. Alexander adopted similar strategies, keeping many former Persian officials in office while inserting Macedonian commanders to oversee them. But trust was fragile. In Sogdiana, a leader named Spitamenes emerged as a particularly persistent opponent. His forces harassed Macedonian detachments, even achieving temporary victories. The conflict became personal and brutal. Entire settlements suspected of aiding rebels were destroyed. Hostages were taken to ensure compliance. Alexander himself participated in dangerous assaults, scaling fortress walls and leading charges to demonstrate that resistance would not break his will. Over time, the rebellions were suppressed. Spitamenes was killed by his own allies, who hoped to gain favor. Bactria and Sogdiana were subdued, though not fully pacified. To solidify loyalty, Alexander married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, symbolizing a union between Macedonian and Persian worlds. It was both a political and cultural gesture. By binding himself to local elites, he attempted to transform conquest into continuity. Yet these years of resistance revealed something essential about the Persian Empire's fall. It had not been uniformly loyal to its central authority in its final decades. The very decentralization that once allowed flexibility now facilitated fragmentation. When the core collapsed, the periphery did not unite in defense of the old order. Instead, it fractured into regional struggles. The empire had lost its unifying force long before Alexander arrived. In the East, the illusion of cohesion finally disappeared. The Persian Empire had fallen, but the lands it once governed would not surrender their identity easily.
With the Eastern resistance largely crushed, Alexander stood as the undisputed ruler of what had once been the Persian Empire. Yet what remained was not a living empire, but a vast structure without a soul. The Achaemenid state had been built around the authority of the great king. His presence was not symbolic alone. It was the axis around which loyalty, administration, and identity revolved. When Darius III died, that axis vanished. Alexander attempted to step into the role, but legitimacy is not transferred by conquest alone. For many Persians, he was still an outsider, a conqueror who wore their crown but did not belong to their lineage.
The Persian Empire had relied on continuity, dynasty, ritual, and tradition stretching back generations. Without that continuity, the system became hollow. Alexander adopted Persian court customs, including elaborate ceremonies and royal dress, hoping to bridge the gap. To Macedonians, this appeared as betrayal. To Persians, it often seemed like imitation without ancestry. This tension revealed the deeper truth. The empire could not simply change hands and remain the same. Its identity had already eroded. Satraps governed provinces with increasing independence, focusing on local stability rather than imperial unity. Taxes flowed unevenly, military obligations were inconsistently met, and communication across distances weakened. Alexander's conquests exposed these fractures rather than creating them. The empire's fall was not a single moment, but the final unraveling of a structure already compromised. Even as Alexander issued decrees in the name of a Persian king, the old sense of imperial belonging was gone. What remained were regions connected by roads and bureaucracy, but no longer by shared belief in a single ruler ordained to govern the world. The Persian Empire had become an idea without a living center, and ideas without belief cannot survive.
As Alexander pushed deeper into the former Persian territories, the empire increasingly existed only as a memory rather than a functioning state. Roads still connected cities, scribes still recorded taxes, and governors still ruled provinces, but the unifying vision that once bound these elements together had faded. The Persian Empire had been more than land and administration. It had been a worldview. It presented itself as the natural order of the world, with the great king at its center, maintaining balance between peoples, gods, and nature. When that worldview collapsed, the machinery of empire continued to move for a time, but without direction. Alexander's rule accelerated this transformation. He founded new cities, settled Greek and Macedonian veterans across Asia, and redirected trade routes toward his own centers of power. Persian elites were gradually absorbed, sidelined, or replaced. Temples that once prayed for the eternal reign of the Achaemenid kings now adapted to new patrons. Over time, loyalty shifted from a universal empire to regional identities and personal allegiances. Former Persian subjects no longer thought of themselves as part of a single imperial project. They became Babylonians, Egyptians, Bactrians, or subjects of a new Hellenistic order. History often remembers empires as falling in fire and blood, but the Persian Empire ended in a quieter way. It dissolved as its symbols lost meaning and its people stopped believing in its permanence. Even Alexander could not revive it, because he ruled a different kind of world, one shaped by conquest rather than continuity. When he died, his own empire fragmented almost immediately, confirming the lesson Persia had already taught. Without shared belief and legitimate succession, even the greatest realms fracture. The Persian Empire did not disappear overnight, but it faded into the past, leaving behind ruins, records, and legends. What survived was its influence, administration, tolerance, infrastructure, adopted by those who came after. In that sense, Persia did not simply fall, it transformed into the foundation upon which new civilizations would build, long after its kings were forgotten. After the fall of the Achaemenid dynasty,
There were moments when it seemed possible that Persia might rise again under a new banner. The land was still vast, rich, and populated by peoples who remembered centuries of imperial unity. The systems of governance, taxation, and communication remained among the most advanced the ancient world had ever known. Yet, despite these advantages, Persia never returned as the single dominant empire it once was. The reason lay not only in military defeat, but in a deeper transformation of power itself. Alexander's conquest shattered the idea that Persia was invincible, and once that belief was gone, no successor could fully restore it. The empire had relied heavily on the sacred authority of the great king, whose legitimacy came from tradition, ritual, and continuity. With that line broken, every new ruler faced the same problem. Power could be seized, but legitimacy could not be easily inherited. Alexander attempted to present himself as a Persian-style monarch, adopting local customs and titles, but to many Persians he remained an outsider, and to many Macedonians he went too far in abandoning his roots. After his death, the struggle among his generals fractured the former Persian lands into competing kingdoms, each more concerned with survival than restoration. These new rulers valued Persian administrative knowledge, but not Persian imperial identity. Over time, loyalty shifted again, this time toward Hellenistic cities, dynasties, and armies. Persia became a region, not a unifying idea. Later powers would rule these lands, but always through different frameworks of authority. The memory of the old empire survived in stories, monuments, and local pride, yet it no longer functioned as a political force capable of uniting Asia under one crown. The world had changed. Warfare was faster, borders were more fluid, and rulers depended increasingly on personal ambition rather than sacred tradition. Persia had been built for a world that valued stability above all else, and when that world ended, so did the empire that embodied it.
It is tempting to imagine the Persian Empire collapsing in a single dramatic moment, as if one defeat erased centuries of power. History, however, tells a quieter and more unsettling story. Persia did not fall overnight. It unraveled slowly, almost invisibly, long before Alexander crossed into Asia. By the time the Macedonian army arrived, many of the forces that had once held the empire together were already weakened or absent. Provincial governors acted more independently. Royal authority was challenged from within the court, and loyalty was increasingly transactional rather than absolute. The empire still appeared strong on maps and in ceremonies, but beneath the surface it was fragmented. Roads still connected distant lands, taxes were still collected, and armies still marched, yet the shared belief in a single imperial destiny was fading. When the first defeats came, they did not shock the system into renewal. Instead, they confirmed doubts that had been growing for years. Cities opened their gates not because they were conquered by force, but because they no longer believed resistance was worth the cost. Elites negotiated rather than fought, calculating survival instead of honor. Even the army, once the backbone of Persian power, reflected this change.
Many soldiers fought bravely, but they were defending regions, commanders, or pay, not an empire they believed would endure forever. This gradual erosion explains why Persia's fall feels almost anticlimactic when examined closely. There was no single day when everything ended, no universal moment of realization. Different parts of the empire fell at different times, some barely noticing the change in rulers at first. Life continued, markets opened, and administrations functioned under new names. What truly ended was not governance, but the idea that Persia was the natural center of the world. Once that idea disappeared, the empire's vast size became a weakness rather than a strength. Coordination slowed, trust weakened, and unity dissolved into memory. The story of Persia's fall is therefore not one of sudden destruction, but of long decay hidden beneath the illusion of permanence. It reminds us that empires often die quietly, long before the final blow is struck, and that the most dangerous moment for a great power is not when it is challenged from without, but when it no longer believes in itself.
When the Persian Empire lost its political independence, it did not vanish from history. In many ways, it survived within the very system that replaced it. Alexander did not destroy the Persian administrative framework, he adopted it. Satrapies remained, tax systems continued, and local elites often stayed in power under new allegiances. Persian scribes kept records, Persian engineers maintained roads, and Persian officials ensured that daily life functioned across vast territories. Even the idea of a universal empire ruling many peoples was not Macedonian in origin, it was Persian. Alexander's vision of ruling Asia as a single realm owed more to Achaemenid ideology than to Greek city-state traditions. The symbols of Persian kingship, from court ritual to royal dress, were gradually incorporated into the new regime. This blending caused tension among Alexander's companions, who feared the loss of Greek identity. Yet it revealed a deeper truth. Persia had shaped the political imagination of the ancient world so thoroughly that even its conquerors could not escape its influence. After Alexander's death, his successors fought bitterly over control, but they all relied on Persian infrastructure to rule. The Seleucid Empire, in particular, inherited much of Persia's eastern territories and governed them using methods developed centuries earlier. Languages changed, dynasties shifted, but the rhythms of imperial administration remained recognizably Persian. Religions and cultural traditions also persisted. Zoroastrian practices continued in many regions, local cults survived, and Persian concepts of cosmic order influenced later religious thought. In this sense, the fall of the Persian Empire was not an erasure, but a transformation. What disappeared was the Achaemenid dynasty, not the civilization it had built. The empire's endurance within its successors highlights a paradox of imperial collapse. Political defeat does not always mean cultural death. Persia's greatest legacy was not its armies or its kings, but its model of governance, tolerance, and scale. By proving that diverse peoples could be ruled under a single system without forced uniformity, Persia set a precedent that future empires would follow, consciously or not. Even Rome, centuries later, reflected Persian lessons in its provincial administration and imperial ideology. The fall of Persia therefore marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of the story.
Its ideas continued to shape the world long after its banners were lowered, reminding us that influence often outlives power, and that the true measure of an empire is not how it falls, but what remains after it is gone.
The fall of the Persian Empire was not the result of a single battle, a single ruler, or a single mistake. It was the outcome of slow changes that weakened the foundations long before Alexander ever crossed into Asia. Persia fell because its system, once revolutionary, became rigid over time. The balance between central authority and regional autonomy, which had once been its greatest strength, gradually turned into a source of vulnerability. Satraps grew powerful, loyalties became divided, and the king's reach, though vast, was no longer absolute. The empire relied heavily on the image of divine kingship and stability, and when that image cracked, confidence collapsed with it. Economic strain, constant military mobilization, and the cost of governing immense territories drained resources and patience. At the same time, Persia faced a changing world. Greek military tactics evolved, professional armies became more flexible, and warfare grew faster and more decisive than the ceremonial displays of power Persia had long relied upon. Leadership also mattered. In its final years, the empire was led by a king who inherited immense responsibility but lacked the authority and adaptability needed to command absolute loyalty. Darius III did not lose because Persia was weak in numbers or wealth. He lost because the system no longer responded effectively to crisis. When Alexander appeared, he was not merely a conqueror, but a catalyst. He exploited existing fractures, moved faster than the imperial bureaucracy could react, and presented himself as an alternative ruler rather than a destroyer. Cities opened their gates not because they loved Macedonia, but because they no longer believed in the permanence of Persian rule. In the end, Persia fell because it believed too strongly in its own permanence. Its sense of inevitability bred complacency, and its vast scale, once a symbol of strength, became an obstacle to swift action. Yet this is not a story of failure alone. The Persian Empire succeeded so completely in shaping administration, culture, and imperial thought that even its fall could not erase its influence. The true lesson of Persia is not that empires collapse when they are weak, but that they collapse when they stop adapting. Persia ruled the ancient world for over 2 centuries, not through terror, but through order, tolerance, and structure. When those structures could no longer evolve, the empire passed its legacy to those who followed. The Persian Empire did not simply fall, it transformed into the blueprint of future empires. And that is why even today, its rise and fall remain one of history's most powerful reminders that greatness is never permanent, but influence can be eternal.